200 worlds had already fallen.
And none of them fought back.
We fed the enemy and mapped their supply lines the same day.
They called it weakness. He is not afraid.
When they sent the fleet that erases worlds, the Terminus fleet emerging from transit.
Supreme Overseer Derek had done this 200 times. 200 planets, 200 species, 200 moments where a civilization looked up at the sky, saw his fleet, and understood, in whatever way their biology allowed them to understand things, that it was over, that the math had resolved, that the Vareth Dominion had arrived, and arriving was the same as winning. He was bored. He sat in his command chair aboard the Eternal Mandate and watched the blue-green planet rotate slowly on the display screen, and felt nothing except a mild irritation that the Conquest report would add 17 more pages to his already unreasonable workload. His adjutant, a young Vareth named Sarek, whose enthusiasm Derek found exhausting, stood at his shoulder with a data pad and a posture that communicated excitement. Derek wished Sarek would stop being excited about things. Preliminary scans complete, Overseer, Sarek said. Single star system, one habitable planet. Dominant species is carbon-based, bilateral symmetry, average height approximately 1.7 standard units. They call themselves humans. Do they have space travel? Limited, they've reached their moon. A few unmanned probes to neighboring planets. Weapons. Primitive by Dominion standards. Chemical propulsion. Nuclear capability, local scale only, nothing that would threaten the fleet. Derek made a sound that meant, fine, let's get this done. Prepare the standard communication package. Surrender terms, integration protocols, the population census forms. Send the cultural absorption team ahead. I want a full liaison briefing before we make ground contact. Yes, Overseer, Sarek hesitated. He had the look of someone holding information they couldn't decide how to deliver. Derek had learned to dislike that look. What? The linguistics team has been working on decoding the planet's broadcast signals for the past 3 rotations, Sarek said. Standard procedure, but they've submitted an unusual request. They're asking for more time. More time. Derek repeated the word slowly, the way he repeated things that made no sense to him. Yes, Overseer. Lead linguist Veth says the signal volume is, she used the word overwhelming. The species broadcasts continuously, across thousands of simultaneous frequencies. They talk to each other constantly. All species communicate. Not like this, sir. Sarek pulled up Veth's preliminary report on the data pad. Most species we've encountered broadcast on a small number of organized frequencies. News, government communications, coordinated cultural output. These humans broadcast everything. Personal conversations, arguments, music in approximately 900 documented variations, recorded history, philosophy, comedy, religion, multiple competing religions debating each other in real time. And a significant portion of the signals are humans describing, in extraordinary detail, how they have harmed each other throughout their history. Derek looked at the data pad. He looked at the planet. They document their own atrocities. Obsessively, sir. And then they argue about them. And then they make artistic representations of them. And then they argue about the artistic representations. He handed the data pad back. Veth has 2 more rotations, then we proceed on schedule. The fleet held position while the cultural absorption team did its work. Derek spent the time reviewing integration protocols for the species they'd absorbed before the humans, a quiet, gentle race called the Pelori who had surrendered within 4 planetary rotations and were now contributing meaningfully to Dominion agricultural output. peaceful, cooperative. The Pelori had understood immediately that the math didn't favor them and had made the rational choice. Every species made the rational choice. Eventually, Veth's report arrived on the 5th rotation, 2 days past her deadline. Derek read it standing at the viewport, the blue-green planet behind the glass, and he read it twice because the first time he thought he'd misunderstood something. The report was not about linguistic patterns or translation matrices. It was about war. Veth had cataloged, to the best of her team's ability, the number of armed conflicts the humans had conducted against each other in their recorded history. Not against other species. They had no other species to fight. Against themselves. Against neighboring populations of their own kind. Over land. Over resources. Over ideology. Over religion. Over borders that had been drawn and redrawn so many times the maps looked like something had bled on them. The number was not thousands. The number was not tens of thousands. Veth had stopped counting at 90,000 distinct documented conflicts and noted that her team believed this represented less than 40% of the actual total. The translator had crashed twice during the cataloging process. Not a malfunction. The processing load had simply exceeded parameters designed for civilizations that fought wars in manageable quantities. At the bottom of the report, Veth had written a single line that was not standard format and not her place to include, but that she had apparently been unable to stop herself from adding. These creatures have been at war with themselves for the entirety of their recorded existence. They have never known peace long enough to forget what conflict feels like. I do not know what this means for integration protocols. I am flagging it for your attention. Derek set the report down. He looked at Sarek, proceed with standard approach, broadcast the surrender terms. The humans assembled their leaders quickly. Derek gave them credit for that. Some species took weeks to organize a response, committee structures, religious consultations, the political chaos of civilizations that had never needed to make a collective decision before. The humans had a global communication network that let them convene representatives across their entire planet in under a day. They were waiting for him when his shuttle touched down. The meeting location was a large building in a city the humans called New York, chosen apparently because it was considered neutral ground between their various political factions. There were people outside the building holding signs. Derek's translator worked on the signs. Some of them said things about peace. Some of them said things he chose not to translate twice. The human leaders sat across a long table. They were various shapes and colors. The species had remarkable physical diversity for a single-planet civilization, and their expressions were difficult to read but not impossible. Derek had 200 worlds of practice reading the body language of species that didn't want him there. What he expected: fear with a diplomatic surface, the controlled stillness of people trying not to show how badly their hands were shaking. What he found was harder to name. They were watching him the way a species watches something it is still deciding how to classify: curious, alert, not performing calm, actually, measurably calm in ways his bioscanners confirmed. Heart rates elevated but controlled. The kind of elevated that came not from fear but from concentration. He delivered the standard speech. 200 iterations had made it smooth. The Varath Dominion represented order. Integration meant stability, shared resources, the end of internal conflict. The alternative to peaceful integration was a demonstration of Dominion capability that no rational species chose to experience. They had 30 planetary rotations to signal compliance. He waited for the silence that always came after, the weight of it settling. A woman at the end of the table, older, with white hair cropped short and eyes that had the quality of things that had been sharp for a long time and hadn't stopped, leaned forward slightly. "Can I ask a question?" Derek gestured for her to proceed. "How many species have refused you?" "None," he said, because it was true. She nodded slowly, not like someone who found this comforting. A man across from her, broad, with a soldier's posture and a face that looked like it had been in an argument with weather for several decades, looked at Derek and said, quietly, without hostility, without performance, "That's a funny thing to assume about the only species that domesticated wolves." Derek didn't know what wolves were. He had his translator flag the word for later. He returned to the Eternal Mandate and found Sarek waiting with the cultural briefing on wolves. He read it. He sat with it for a while. Wolves, the briefing explained, were large predatory animals that humans had, roughly 15,000 years ago, begun to befriend. Not to eat, not to use as beasts of burden initially, to befriend. They had looked at an apex predator and thought, with the particular audacity of a species that had apparently never learned appropriate caution, that could be mine. And it had worked. Derek read the briefing 3 times. Then he looked at the planet through the viewport. Then he filed the standard post-contact report, which had a field for anomalies, and left it blank, because he didn't have language yet for what he was trying to describe. He gave the order to begin occupation preparations. He did not sleep well that rotation, which was unusual for him. He was a man of 200 successful conquests. There was nothing here that should have kept him awake. He lay in the dark of his quarters and thought about the woman's question. How many species have refused you? Not what happens if we refuse, not what are our options. She had asked how many had refused, past tense, historical data, as if she were building a picture of something. Outside the viewport, the blue-green planet turned. Patient, like something that had been waiting for a long time and had learned not to mind the wait. The Vareth were very good at occupation. 200 worlds had taught them the shape of it, how to land troops without causing unnecessary panic, how to establish control nodes at communication hubs and power infrastructure, how to install local administrative proxies from cooperative members of the conquered species, so that the occupied population directed their resentment at familiar faces instead of Vareth ones. It was efficient. It was clean. It had worked without meaningful variation across 600 years of Dominion expansion. On Earth, by the 3rd rotation, something was already wrong. Derek couldn't point to it yet. The humans hadn't attacked. The occupation nodes were installed. The administrative proxies were in place. Humans who had calculated correctly that cooperation offered better survival odds than defiance. The population was not rioting. But something was wrong. Garrison Commander Preth, a blunt and practical Vareth who had managed occupations on 11 worlds, filed a report that Derek read twice with a growing sense of unease he couldn't fully explain. The report said, in its formal language, the local population is behaving in ways that do not map to standard post-contact behavioral models. Recommend cultural analysis team review. What the report meant, stripped of its formal language, was, I don't know what they're doing and it's making me uncomfortable. Derek summoned Preth and asked him to be specific. Preth stood in Derek's office on the Eternal Mandate and looked like a soldier trying to report a situation his training hadn't covered. They feed us, Preth said. Derek waited. The civilian population near our garrison installations. They bring food, cooked food. They leave it at the perimeter and then they leave. No requests, no demands, no communication. They just bring food. Perhaps it's a gesture of submission. I considered that, Overseer, but the behavioral analysts say it doesn't match submission patterns. When the Pelori submitted, they avoided our soldiers. They looked at the ground. These humans make eye contact. They watch us eat. Preth stopped. He looked like the next sentence was difficult. They what? They ask questions, sir. About us. About Vareth food preferences. About whether the garrison soldiers have families. One of my soldiers was asked what his mother's name was. Derek looked at Preth for a long moment, and he told her. There was a silence in the office. File a full report, Derek said. Behavioral analysis, everything. I want it on my desk by next rotation. Preth left. Derek turned to the viewport and the planet below and thought about a species that fed its conquerors and asked for their mothers' names. He thought about wolves. He thought about the woman's question. He did not yet have the word for what he was feeling. The Vareth language had no word for it because the Vareth had not felt it in a very long time. Her name was Myra Osai, and she had a smile that she wore the way a locksmith wears a set of picks, always available, always useful, never what it appeared to be. She had been assigned as a cooperative liaison 3 rotations after the occupation began. She spoke to Vareth administrators in the careful, helpful voice of someone who wanted to make things easier. She attended briefings. She filed reports on human-civilian attitudes, reports that were accurate enough to be credible, and shaped carefully enough to tell the Vareth exactly what she wanted them to think. In the evenings, she wrote a different set of notes. She wrote about Vareth blinking patterns and what they seemed to mean. She wrote about the way Vareth soldiers held their weapons when they were relaxed versus when they were alert. The angle changed by approximately 12 degrees. She had measured it against door frames. She wrote about which administrators responded to politeness, and which ones responded to deference, and which ones responded to nothing at all and needed to be worked around. She wrote about the occupation's logistics, where the supply convoys came from, how frequently, what routes they used, which nodes depended on which power sources. She wrote it all in a personal journal filled with pressed flowers and a recipe for her grandmother's stew, because the Vareth Cultural Analysis Team had scanned it and found nothing threatening about pressed flowers and recipes. She passed the information through 7 different hands before it reached the people who needed it. The 7th hand was a boy who sold fruit at a market near the Eastern Garrison installation. He was 14, and he had memorized every supply convoy schedule Myra had recorded and could recite it backwards if you asked him to, which no one did, because there was no reason to be theatrical about it. The Vareth noticed, by the 2nd month, that humans didn't regulate their own biology in predictable ways. This was not a small thing. For an occupying force managing a population of several billion, predictability was everything. The Pelori had slept in synchronized cycles. They ate at consistent intervals. Their movements through occupied zones followed patterns that Vareth management systems could map and account for. Humans slept when they were tired, which was not always at night and not always for the same duration. They ate at irregular intervals and in quantities that varied enormously between individuals. They moved through occupied zones at all hours for reasons that frequently had no apparent practical purpose. They walked, they said, to think. They gathered in groups with no logistical function. They made music in the street at 2 in the morning for an audience of no one. One Vareth monitoring analyst filed a note stating simply, "This species does not appear to have a resting state." It was meant as an observation about logistics. It was more accurate than the analyst knew. There were things the Vareth saw happening and didn't understand. Across the occupied zones, humans were telling each other stories. Not unusual, all species communicated culturally under occupation. The Vareth had protocols for monitoring cultural output and flagging dangerous content. The protocols were designed to catch things like organized resistance calls or weapons information disguised as folklore. The protocols did not flag children's songs. They did not flag recipes. They did not flag the way an old man in a market would tell a story about his grandfather's grandfather to anyone who stood still long enough to listen. A story about a time when his people had been occupied before by other humans, and what had happened to those occupiers eventually. The protocols did not flag the pamphlets that looked like religious texts and were passed hand to hand in quiet places. The Vareth translators had scanned the pamphlets. They contained prayers, hymns, passages about endurance and faith. Between the hymns, in an ink that only showed under a specific light frequency that the Vareth scanners didn't use, were maps, supply routes, node locations, guard rotation schedules, all of it accurate, all of it current. The humans were archiving everything. The Vareth conquered species forgot. They always forgot. Not because they were unintelligent, but because forgetting was how occupied populations survived. You let go of what you were before, you accommodated the new reality, you built a life inside the available space. It was rational. It was adaptive. The humans were doing the opposite. They were building a library of everything the Vareth were doing. They were making sure no one forgot. They were making the occupation's own actions into a record that would outlast the occupation, making the very fact of their suffering into a document, a lesson, a thing that could be handed to their children the way you hand someone a tool. Derek found out about the pamphlets on the 45th rotation. He summoned his intelligence chief and asked how long it had been going on. "We believe since approximately the second rotation, Overseer." 6 weeks. "Yes, sir." "They've been documenting our occupation for 6 weeks." "Yes, sir. We've confiscated several hundred copies. The content keeps updating." Derek dismissed the intelligence chief and stood alone in his office for a while. He thought about something Preth had told him 3 weeks earlier. A human man had been found sitting in a bombed-out building in what had been a residential district before a garrison installation was constructed nearby. He had been writing. A patrol had stopped him and demanded to know what he was writing. The man had looked up at the Vareth soldiers with the calm expression of someone interrupted during light housework. He had said, "Everything you're doing wrong." The patrol had not known what to do with this. They had filed a report. The report had made its way to Derek's desk, and he had read it and then not known what to do with it either. He pulled it back out now and read it again. "Everything you're doing wrong." Not defiance, not bravado, not the bark of someone trying to seem brave in front of a weapon. The soldier's report noted that his tone was, they had struggled to describe it, administrative. Like a man doing a job he considered important and didn't particularly want interrupted. Derek looked at the planet through the viewport, the blue-green planet that had not surrendered and had not attacked. That fed his soldiers and mapped his supply lines simultaneously. That sang songs with hidden ink and sent 14-year-olds to memorize convoy schedules and asked Vareth soldiers what their mothers' names were. He opened the anomaly field of his standard occupation report. He stared at it for a long time. He still didn't have language for what he was trying to describe. He closed the report without filling it in. Outside on the planet below, someone was writing something down. They were all writing something down. They had been writing things down. Derek was beginning to understand, since before he arrived. And they would be writing things down long after. It started on a Tuesday. Not because Tuesdays had any special meaning in the human calendar. Not because any commander had designated it. It started on a Tuesday because that was the morning a Vareth supply convoy took a road it had taken 43 times before, and the road was not the same road anymore. The explosion took out the lead vehicle and the rear vehicle simultaneously. The 3 in the middle stopped. The soldiers inside had 12 seconds to understand what was happening before the second set of charges went. They used 8 of those seconds filing an emergency beacon. By the time the response unit arrived, there was no one there. No bodies, no weapons left behind, no visible exit route that made sense given the terrain. Just the burning convoy and 12 seconds of beacon data and a single piece of paper left on the road, held down by a stone so the wind wouldn't take it. The paper had 2 words on it. The translator rendered them as, "We remember." Yusuf al-Rashid did not look like a man who planned things. He looked like a man things happened to and then regretted. He was very large. He had a face that had held a lot of weather and a lot of years, and had not been made kinder by either. He moved slowly in the way that very large things moved slowly, not because they couldn't move faster, but because they had long since stopped needing to prove it. He had been a soldier before the Varath came. He had been a soldier for 23 years in places where the word soldier meant something complicated and heavy. He had fought in 3 wars, all of them against other humans, all of them in the specific geography of human politics, where borders and beliefs and resources ground against each other until someone bled. He was done with human wars. He had 1 war left in him, and he intended to spend it carefully. He ran his operations from the back of a restaurant that made very good lamb. He chose it because the smell of cooking food was consistent and strong, which made the signal detection equipment the Varath used for locating radio communications significantly less effective. He had learned this by testing it. He had learned most things by testing them. His network was not built on ideology. He had no speeches. He had no flag and no manifesto. He had a map on the wall and a schedule on the table and a group of people who came and went at irregular hours and ate the lamb, and left with instructions so specific they didn't require interpretation. He didn't ask people why they were fighting. He asked what they could do and where they could do it and whether they could do it quietly. The ones who wanted to talk about their reasons he sent somewhere else. Reasons were good things to have privately. Publicly, they made noise. The Varath he had figured out by studying Myra's notes and Preth's occupation reports and the behavioral data smuggled out of the monitoring stations, were very good at managing things that followed patterns. They were experienced. They were technically superior. They had done this 200 times. What they had not done, 200 times or ever, was manage something that refused to have a pattern. So he built a resistance with no pattern. Attacks happened at random intervals that were not random. They were scheduled on a calendar so complex it looked random from outside. They came from different directions every time. They used different methods. Explosives once, sabotage the next. The time after that, just a missing component from a key piece of equipment, something small enough that it took the Varath 3 days to identify what had failed and why. Every action was recorded and broadcast before the Varath could suppress it. This was the part that Derek would think about longest later, not the attacks themselves, the broadcasts, every convoy that burned, every node that went dark, every small act of defiance from a planet that was not supposed to be defiant. It was documented and sent out within hours. The footage, the accounts, the names of the people involved. Martyrdom, his intelligence chief had explained to him. The idea that death in the act of resistance made the resistance stronger, that the dead became fuel. Derek had sat with this concept for a long time. It violated something fundamental in his understanding of rational behavior. Dead was dead. Dead was a subtraction, not an addition. The math was simple. But the math kept being wrong. General Voss made a decision on the 60-second rotation of the occupation. He was not a subtle man. He was the kind of military commander who had gotten where he was by solving problems in ways that removed the problem permanently and didn't worry overmuch about what was standing next to the problem when it was removed. He had managed 3 occupation uprisings before Earth. All 3 were now resolved. All 3 had resolved the same way. He destroyed a hospital. It was not a military target. It was a medical facility serving 40,000 civilians in a population center in the Eastern Zone. He destroyed it because it was a symbol, because it was the kind of loss that broke the heart of a population and made them ask whether the cost of resistance was worth the price. He had seen it work 3 times. He filed the order with the certainty of a man who had a working method. By the next rotation, 600,000 people had joined the resistance networks. He stared at the intelligence report, and then he filed a second report with a note that the first action had apparently not achieved the intended result, and that a follow-up response was being prepared. He did not understand what had gone wrong. He did not have Darak's unease or Preth's careful discomfort or the quiet alarm growing in the cultural analysis team. He had just done the thing that worked, the thing that had always worked. Darak read Voss's reports and felt the anomaly field of his occupation report pressing on him like something physical. He had an answer now for what was different. He had gotten it not from his analysts or his intelligence teams but from Preth, who had been in the field every day of the occupation and had the look of a man who had seen something he hadn't been able to categorize since. "They don't break the same way," Preth said. "The Pelori, when we hit them hard, they went quiet, internal. They grieved privately and then they accommodated. These humans," he stopped. "They get louder," Darak said. "Yes, sir. Every loss they get louder. They name the dead. They say the names out loud publicly, they repeat them. The hospital, within 2 days there were crowds in the street just saying names. Thousands of people standing in the street saying names." Darak said nothing. "I had a crowd like that outside my garrison installation. 3,000 people, not armed, not attacking, just standing there saying names." Preth's jaw was tight. "I didn't know what order to give. There's no protocol for it." He was right, there was no protocol for it. The captured Varath soldier's name was Karath. He was 22 years old and had been doing border patrol work in a zone that turned out not to be where the border was. He had been separated from his unit during a rapid response action and had made the tactical error of entering a building that was occupied. He was held for 11 days. They fed him. They treated the cut on his forearm from where he'd caught it on a fence post during the confusion of his capture. A woman came every 2 days who was not unkind and asked him questions in the careful, precise Varath that Myra Osai had been teaching selected members of the network for the past 6 weeks. The questions were not about military information. They were about him, where he was from, whether he had siblings, what he wanted to do when the occupation ended, not if when, stated casually like a fact already settled. On the 11th day, they gave him a meal and walked him to a road that led back to the garrison zone and sent him on his way. They gave him a message. 6 words. He repeated them once to Darak, standing in the overseer's office with the expression of a young man who had been somewhere he hadn't expected to go. "We have done this before." "What does it mean?" Darak asked, though he was already turning the words over in his mind like a stone he'd found and couldn't identify. Karath hesitated. "Before I left," he said slowly, "I asked the woman who had been questioning me what it meant. She said to tell you it wasn't a threat." "What is it then?" "She said it was a description." Darak dismissed Karath and stood alone in his office for a long time. "We have done this before. Not we will defeat you. Not you cannot win. A description, historical data, a species that had fought 90,000 documented wars, only 40% of the actual total. Veth had noted, telling him calmly that this situation was familiar to them. That they had been exactly here before. That they knew the shape of this. He pulled up the conquest records for all 200 species. He looked at them for a long time. He was looking for something, and he was becoming increasingly afraid he already knew what he was going to find. He found it quickly. It was not a trend or a pattern or an anomaly. It was a constant. Across 200 species, across 600 years of Dominion expansion, it was the one thing that never varied. Every species, when the cost of resistance exceeded what they could process, made the rational choice. They stopped. They calculated that survival inside occupation was better than extinction outside it, and they were right. The math was correct. The Dominion absorbed them and managed them, and they continued to exist, diminished but living, which was more than the alternative. Darak looked for the variable that made humans different. He read for 6 hours. He did not find it. He closed the records and looked at the planet through the viewport. The planet that was nomming its dead out loud in streets, that was getting louder with every loss, that had looked at a Vareth soldier it had captured and fed him lamb stew and asked about his siblings, and sent him home with a message that called itself a description. Anger rushed through him then. But underneath it, quiet and unfamiliar as an old word in a language he hadn't spoken in years, something else. Something he couldn't name yet. Something that made him leave his office and walk the long corridor to his quarters and lie in the dark, and stare at the ceiling and not sleep. Outside, the planet turned, patient, getting louder. Derek requested the full conquest records on the 91st rotation of the occupation. Not the standard summaries he reviewed regularly. The full records, 600 years of data, unedited, including the files that were sealed under administrative classification, because they contained information deemed not operationally relevant to ongoing campaigns. He sat in his office for 3 rotations going through them, the way a man goes through old boxes when he suspects something important has been buried, not sure what he's looking for, sure it's there. He found the constant he'd already found. Every species surrendered when the cost became too high. He found the sub-pattern beneath it. Every species had a threshold, a specific type of loss that broke the will to continue. Some broke on civilian casualties. Some broke on infrastructure destruction. Some broke when their leaders were captured. The Vareth had gotten very good over 600 years at identifying the threshold quickly and applying the correct pressure to it. He looked for Earth's threshold. He went through every action taken since the occupation began. The hospital, the broadcast suppressions, the execution of 14 resistance fighters in a public square in the second month, the standard deterrence protocol that had worked reliably on 8 separate occupied worlds. After the hospital, 600,000 new resistance members. After the broadcast suppressions, the resistance moved to lower-tech communication that was harder to suppress, handwritten, spoken, songs. After the executions, the 14 faces were painted on the side of every Vareth garrison installation within a week, not as threat, as record. No threshold. Every pressure point he applied, they incorporated. They didn't break on their breaking points, they built on them. He closed the records. He called Sarek into his office. "I need to understand something," he said, "about human history. Specifically, have they been occupied before, by other humans?" Sarek checked the cultural database. Multiple times, overseer, colonization events, empire structures, several periods in which one group of humans politically and militarily dominated other groups of humans for extended periods. How long did those occupations last? Sarek pulled the data. He was quiet for a moment. It varies widely. Some lasted generations, some centuries. And how did they end? Sarek looked at the data for a longer moment. Almost all of them ended, he said carefully, with the occupied population eventually expelling the occupier. Derek sat with this. Almost all. A small number ended through full integration, where the distinction between occupier and occupied dissolved over time. But in the majority of cases, Sarek stopped. He looked like he was reading something that was changing the shape of a thought he'd been having. In the majority of cases, the occupied humans eventually won, Derek said. The timescales are very long, overseer, decades, centuries in some cases. They waited centuries. In some cases, yes, sir. Derek nodded once and dismissed Sarek, and then sat alone in his office for the rest of that rotation, and thought about a species that had been losing for most of its history, and had never once concluded from this that losing was permanent. They brought Myra Osai to him on the 104th rotation. A patrol had found the network she was running, not the whole network, one thread of it, pulled when a courier made a mistake that any courier could make, and that she had planned for, and which gave away only enough to make her capture look like a significant intelligence gain. She had arranged her own capture with the same careful attention she brought to grocery lists. She sat across from Derek in an interrogation room that was not uncomfortable. He had not made it uncomfortable deliberately. He was curious about her in a way that discomfort would not serve. She looked around the room when she was brought in, cataloging it. He noticed the exits, the camera positions, the furniture, not frantically. The way a person looks at a hotel room before deciding where to put their bag. She folded her hands. "I've been wondering what you look like up close," she said. "I've been wondering the same about you," he said, which surprised him as he said it because it was true. He had read her file 6 times. He knew about her doctorate in xenobiology, which she had completed before the Vareth arrived, and which had apparently made her the only person in the liaison program who looked at the occupiers and saw not enemies but subjects. He knew about the grocery lists. He knew about the pressed flour journal. He had a copy of it on his desk and had read every recipe 3 times because he kept feeling he was missing something. "Do you want to start with the network?" she asked, "or were you going to work up to it?" "I'd like to start with something else." "All right." He had a list of questions he had been saving, things that the data didn't answer. He went through them and she answered, in the calm, straightforward manner of someone who was choosing what to give away and giving it without making the choice visible. He asked about the threshold without using that word. He described what he had observed, every pressure point failing, every loss becoming fuel. He asked how. She thought about it, not performing thought, actually considering the question, which he appreciated. "You keep thinking there's a mechanism," she said. "Some psychological lever that we have and you haven't found yet. Something to push on that would break it. Isn't there?" "No," she said it simply. "There isn't a mechanism, it's not a strategy we're running, it's just what we are." She paused. "You've been occupied before, your species." He was surprised. "No." "Yes, not by another species, you haven't met enough of those, but internally, in your history, Vareth fighting Vareth, before the Dominion unified." He said nothing. "I read your historical files, the ones in the cultural database your cultural absorption team shared." She almost smiled. "The Unification Wars, 1,200 years ago, the Vareth who lost those wars, what happened to them?" He knew the history. They were absorbed into the dominant faction structure. Their culture was integrated. "They stopped," she said. "They made the rational choice. They calculated. And that is why you've been able to do this 200 times, because you conquered species that think about survival the same way your ancestors thought about it. Make the calculation. Accept the outcome. Continue." She leaned forward slightly. "We don't work that way. We've never worked that way. I don't know if it's a flaw or a feature, you could argue it either way. But we have been losing things for the entire length of our history, and we have never once internally agreed that losing was the same as finished." She sat back. "The variable you're missing isn't a tactic. It's that we're comfortable in the losing position. We've lived there so long we built furniture." He sat with this for a while. Then he asked her about the Vareth. She answered his questions about Vareth biology and culture with the attentiveness of someone who had been studying him since the first day. She had noticed things about his species that his own people didn't notice because they didn't have the outside view. She asked if Vareth dreamed. He told her they did rarely, and she wrote nothing down, but he could see her filing it. He asked, "Do you think this ends?" "Yes," she said. "I think it ends with you leaving." Not aggressively, as a projection, a read of probable outcomes. "We've absorbed 200 species. You haven't absorbed one that's been practicing losing for 100,000 years," she said. "You don't have a protocol for that. And the longer you're here, the more everyone in your dominion watches a planet that won't stop." She looked at him steadily. "You know what the most dangerous thing we've done isn't the attacks." He waited. "It's the frequency." He felt the word land. He stood. The conversation was over, not because he'd gotten what he needed, but because she'd given him something he needed to sit with privately and she knew it. He could see she knew it, and she said nothing else as the guards took her back to her cell. Al-Rashid's trap closed on the 109th rotation. 3 months of supply convoy attacks that looked like disorganized opportunism. 3 months of Vareth logistics rerouting around damaged infrastructure, finding new routes, optimizing around the disruption. 3 months of human cooperative liaisons filing helpful traffic reports that suggested the most efficient alternative routes. The alternative routes were the trap. All of them fed into 4 key junctions. All 4 junctions were gone within a 72-hour period. Not explosions, subtler. Structural failures in bridges that had been inspected and certified by Vareth engineering teams who had not thought to look for the specific method used. Power disruptions at relay stations. A single missing component in a fuel processing facility that took 6 hours to identify and another 18 to repair. The occupation's supply chain for the northern and eastern zones collapsed. Not permanently, the Vareth had redundancies, but the redundancies took 3 weeks to activate. Al-Rashid used those 3 weeks. He didn't broadcast what happened. For once, he went quiet. What the Vareth found instead, when they audited their own records during the supply chain failure, was that information had been leaking out of their monitoring systems for 90 days with a precision that meant someone had been inside not just the logistics network but the diagnostic network, had been watching the Vareth watch the resistance, had known what they knew and what they didn't know, and had planned around it. Derek read the audit report on the 112th rotation. Then he sent a secure message to the Dominion High Command. The message said, "This occupation requires a strategic review." He received a response in less than a rotation, which was fast for High Command, and told him they had been watching. The response said, "Strategic review denied. The Terminus fleet has been authorized." He read the message. He looked at the planet. He thought about Myra Osai saying the word frequency and watching his face as it landed. He thought about a woman with white hair asking how many species had refused and what she had been building with the answer. He thought about wolves. He filed no response to High Command because there was no response in the Vareth language for what he was trying to say, and he had known for some time that the anomaly field of his occupation report was not going to be sufficient. The Terminus fleet was coming. And somewhere below him, in a restaurant that smelled of lamb, a very large man with a face that had held a lot of weather was looking at a map on a wall, and he had known this was coming too. He had planned for it. He had been planning for it since before Al-Rashid knew Darak's name. The Terminus fleet arrived on the 120th rotation. 47 vessels. The largest was 4 times the size of the Eternal Mandate. They came out of the transit point at the edge of the solar system in a formation that was not subtle. It was not designed to be subtle. The Terminus fleet's purpose was not tactical. It was communicative. It said one thing in a language that needed no translation. "This is the last thing we send." Darak stood at the viewport of the Eternal Mandate and watched them come, and felt nothing that he had a clean word for. He had requested to remain in system. High Command had permitted it. He did not know if they had permitted it as professional courtesy, or because they wanted a witness, or because they no longer considered him relevant enough to bother removing. Fleet Admiral Boren commanded the Terminus fleet. She was older than Darak, harder in the way that certain materials were harder, not flexible at all, which in some contexts was strength and in others was how things broke. She contacted him once on the first rotation after arrival. "Overseer," she said. Her voice had the quality of someone who had finished the conversation before it started. "You'll observe standard withdrawal protocols for your vessels. We'll begin planetary assessment within 2 rotations." "Planetary assessment," Darak said. "Standard Terminus procedure." He knew what it meant. Terminus procedure meant that the Dominion had decided the planet was not worth occupying, that the cost of a continued occupation exceeded the value of what the occupation would produce. The Terminus fleet did not occupy. It did not negotiate. It performed a specific and final action, and then it left, and the planet it left was not a place any more so much as a data point in Dominion records under a category that had been used exactly once before. The category had no name in Common Varath. It was a bureaucratic code. The species that had generated the only previous entry in that category was not available for comment. "I'd like to make a formal operational recommendation," Derek said. "Noted," said Boren, which meant no. She closed the communication. He stood at the viewport. Below him, the planet was broadcasting. He'd noticed it 3 hours after the Terminus fleet arrived. Every frequency the humans used, all of them, simultaneously had gone active, not with calls for help, not with communications directed at the fleet. The broadcast was going outward, in every direction, on every band they could reach. He had Sarek pull the content. It was not military information. It was not weapons data or strategic intelligence. It was everything they had documented about the occupation. The full record. Broadcast openly, the supply convoy that burned on a Tuesday and the 2 words left on a piece of paper. The garrison soldiers who had eaten the food the civilians brought. The young soldier who had told a woman his mother's name. The 14 names painted on the garrison walls. Karath's face when he came back from 11 days of captivity and lamb stew and questions about his siblings. The hospital. Every mistake Voss had made, and the 600,000 people it had created. Derek's own words, recorded during his interrogation of Myra Osai in rooms he had believed were private. His questions, the fact that he had asked questions at all. The moments every Varath soldier had hesitated. The moments they had chosen to file reports instead of pulling triggers. All of it broadcast on every frequency, aimed not at the Terminus fleet. Aimed at everyone else. At the 200 worlds the Dominion had absorbed. At the species that had been quiet for decades, for centuries, that had made the rational choice and continued to exist inside the available space, that had learned to let go and accommodate and build lives under the occupation and forget slowly what they had been before. The humans were not talking to the Terminus fleet. They were talking to every other species that had ever been where they were standing. They were giving them the frequency. Derek received a personal transmission 6 hours after the broadcast began. It was from Myra Osai, still in custody in the detention facility in the Eastern Zone. He did not know how she had accessed a transmission channel. He had a feeling that if he investigated, he would find something impressively simple that his security team would be embarrassed about. She said, "You already know what you are now." She closed the transmission. He played it back twice. Then he went to find Sarek, which took 7 minutes because Sarek was at a monitoring station, watching something on a secondary screen with an expression Derek hadn't seen on his adjutant's face before. "What is it?" Derek said. Sarek turned the screen toward him. The monitoring system tracked communication activity across all occupied zones. It was designed to flag organized resistance communication, sudden spikes in coordinated signal traffic that indicated planning activity. It had been flagging constantly for months, enough that the flags had become background noise. What it was showing now was different. The spikes were not on Earth. "These are coming from," Sarek started. "I can read it," Derek said. The signals were coming from occupied worlds, multiple worlds, not 1 or 2, 7, then 12, then as he watched the number change, 17. Species that had been absorbed, species that had been silent, species whose compliance rate had been logged in Dominion records as stable and continuing and permanent. They were talking to each other. The humans had given them the frequency, and they had found each other. 17 worlds that had never spoken to each other, that had been separated by the architecture of an empire specifically designed to prevent exactly this, were talking. They were saying things that Vareth monitoring systems had never been designed to flag because they were not calls to arms. They were not weapons or strategy. They were names, stories, records of what had been done to them and how long it had been, and what they remembered of what they had been before. They were writing things down. Aboard the Resistance Operations Center, a restaurant that smelled of lamb, now relocated to a different building that also smelled of lamb because Al-Rashid had long since decided that the cooking was not optional. 12 men and women did a thing that had no tactical justification by any metric Derek's analysts would have recognized as rational. They put on suits. Not uniforms, not tactical gear, actual suits. The kind worn to funerals and important meetings. Al-Rashid's was slightly too large in the shoulders because he had borrowed it, and the man he had borrowed it from was slightly smaller. He had not mentioned this. It seemed like the wrong thing to mention. They boarded shuttles, 7 shuttles moving toward the Terminus fleet. They were not armed. They carried nothing that a weapons scanner would flag. What they carried were data drives, hundreds of them distributed across every pocket, the full record. Everything Myra had collected, everything the pamphlet networks had documented, everything the 14-year-old fruit seller had memorized about convoy schedules. The entire story of what had happened on Earth since the Vareth arrived, packaged in a format that any digital system in the Dominion could read. The Terminus fleet's outer defense system locked onto the shuttles immediately. Al-Rashid in the lead shuttle activated the transmission that he had pre-recorded 3 weeks ago because he had known this day was coming, and he had wanted time to get the words right. He was not a man given to speeches. He said 5 sentences. You have come here to erase us. We understand why. 200 times has made you certain. We want you to know before you do it that the frequency is already out there. You can end us. You cannot end the signal. The shuttles kept moving. The Terminus fleet's weapons locked solid. The shuttles kept moving. The Terminus fleet's weapons stayed locked. They did not fire. Admiral Boren's bridge was very quiet. She had given the targeting order. The system had confirmed the targeting order. The automated sequence was running. In 43 seconds the problem would be resolved. One of her officers said, "Admiral, the shuttles are not altering course." "I can see that," she said. 31 seconds. "They have no weapons," another officer said, statting information that was already known, statting it because the room needed something to do with itself. "I know," she said. 20 seconds. She looked at the tactical display. 7 small shuttles in suits that didn't fit quite right, coming toward a fleet that had ended a civilization once before and had been sent here specifically to do it again. Not altering course. 15 seconds. She had done this before. Once. One prior deployment, one prior target, one category entry in a bureaucratic code that had no name. She had been younger. She had given the order and it had been given, and she had filed the report and moved forward. She had not thought about it much since. She was thinking about it now. 10 seconds. The officer at the targeting station looked at her, waiting. She thought about 17 worlds suddenly making noise. She thought about species that had been silent for decades finding a frequency. She thought about a broadcast going in every direction, still going, that could not be unsent. You can end us. You cannot end the signal. 5 seconds. She said, "Stand down." The room went very still. "Stand down," she said again. "Targeting sequence abort. All weapons to standby." "Silence." "Admiral." "File it as a tactical reassessment," she said. Her voice was level. "We are withdrawing for strategic review." She turned away from the display. She did not look at the shuttles. She did not want to see what they did when the targeting lock released, the very human thing she suspected they would do, which would make this harder. She went to her private office and closed the door. She sat. She did not think about anything for a while. When she started thinking again, the first thing she thought about was that code in the records, the bureaucratic category, the species that was not there anymore. She thought, I don't know what their word for morning was. She did not know why this particular thing came to her. It was not a strategic thought. It was not operational. She sat with it for a long time. Derek watched the Terminus fleet begin its withdrawal sequence from the viewport of the Eternal Mandate. He had not been informed in advance. He had simply watched the weapons lock release on the tactical display, and then watched the fleet begin to move and understood what had happened without being told. Sarek appeared at his shoulder. The High Command will want to report, Sarek said quietly. I know. What will you tell them? Derek looked at the planet, the blue-green planet that had not surrendered, that had fed his soldiers and mapped his supply lines and named its dead out loud and sent 14-year-olds to memorize schedules and given every other silent world in the Dominion a frequency to find each other on. He thought about what Myra had said. You already know what you are now. He did know. He had known for some time. He had just been waiting for the language to catch up to the knowledge. He said, I'll tell them that the occupation is concluded, that the strategic cost exceeded projected integration value, that a tactical withdrawal was the rational choice. And if they ask why the Terminus fleet didn't complete its mission, then I'll tell them Admiral Boren is a strategist of unusual subtlety. He paused. And I'll tell them that the signal is already out there, that 17 worlds are talking to each other right now, that what we do next will be on every frequency in the Dominion before we finish doing it. Sarek said nothing. They'll understand that, Derek said. They understand signals, they understand reach, they'll calculate. And they would make the rational choice. He was sure of that. The Varith did not come back. They told themselves it was strategic, a repositioning, a calculation. The Dominion had 200 worlds. One world that refused was a footnote, an anomaly, a data point that could be managed by reclassification. They were very good at reclassification. They reclassified Earth as a non-integration zone, pending review. The review was never scheduled. On 17 worlds, quiet things were happening. Small things. The kind of things that monitoring systems weren't designed to flag because they looked like cultural output. Songs, stories, pamphlets with pressed flowers, old men telling long stories to anyone who stood still long enough. The humans had given them more than a frequency. They had given them an example. Not of strength, not of victory, something stranger. The example of a species that had been losing for 100,000 years and had never once decided from this that losing was the same as finished. That had looked at the arithmetic of extinction and said, simply and without drama, we've been here before. We know the shape of this. We're comfortable here. Let's begin. The Varith continued their expansion. They found other species. They absorbed them. But something had changed in the architecture of the Dominion, and the change was quiet enough that it took a long time to see clearly. The absorbed species were not as quiet as they had been. The compliance rates were still high. The math was still the math. But the monitoring systems flagged things they hadn't flagged before. Songs that had double meanings. Stories about other worlds told to children. And sometimes, late in the reporting cycles, there were signals. Faint ones, on unusual frequencies. Saying names. Saying we remember. Saying we are writing things down. The Varith analysts flagged the signals and filed reports, and the reports went into a category, and the category did not yet have a name. Derek, retired from field service and working a desk position that High Command had given him because removing him entirely would have required explaining why. read the reports when they came across his screen. All of them. He read them the way a man reads letters from a country he once visited and cannot stop thinking about. He kept a copy of Myra Osei's pressed flower journal on his desk. He still hadn't found what he was missing in the recipes. He suspected, some days, that he had been missing it so long that finding it was no longer the point, that the looking was the point, that she had known he would keep looking, and had left the journal the way you leave a window open, not to let something in, but to make sure the air could move. He looked at the planet on his desk display sometimes. Still there. Still blue-green. Still broadcasting on every frequency. Still sending the signal outward in every direction into a galaxy that was, slowly and quietly, and in ways no monitoring system had been designed to detect, beginning to listen. He thought about wolves. He thought about a woman with white hair who had asked how many species had refused. He thought about what she had been building with the answer. He turned off his desk display. He went home. Outside, somewhere in the dark between stars, 17 worlds were talking. And for the first time in 600 years of Dominion expansion, the Vareth did not know what came next. That was new. That was, Derek thought, in the quiet of his apartment, with the galaxy turning slowly outside his window, a very human thing to leave behind.